The healer's cabin smelled of wood smoke and rabbit stew when Fenna Frosthelm set down her spoon and said, so casually it might have been a comment about the weather, "Orcs mate for life, you know." And then she reached across the rough-hewn table, ladled another generous helping into Garrett Everwood's bowl, and simply watched his face with those amber eyes that caught the firelight like polished stone. Garrett paused mid-bite, the wooden spoon hovering near his mouth, and felt heat creep up his neck that had nothing to do with the steam rising from his supper. He was a man of 43 winters, a healer who had seen births and deaths and every messy thing between, and he prided himself on keeping his composure in most circumstances. But Fenna had a way of tilting his world with the smallest gestures, and he was not entirely sure what to do about it. "That's so," he managed, setting the spoon down with what he hoped looked like easy nonchalance. "Must make courtship a weighty business." "It does," she said, and her small tusk showed when she smiled, just barely visible at the corners of her mouth. Her green skin seemed to glow in the warm light, and there was something in her expression that was patient and amused and terrifyingly direct all at once. "We choose carefully. Once. Then that is that." From the corner of the cabin came a rattling cough, and both their heads turned toward the cot, where Fenna's father lay propped on every pillow and spare blanket Garrett owned. Tormund Frosthelm was a broad-shouldered orc with iron-gray hair and skin the color of summer leaves. And 3 days ago he had arrived at Garrett's door with a fever that could have killed him, and a puncture wound in his side that spoke of something with claws and malice. Fenna had half-carried him through a blizzard that was still howling outside the cabin walls, demanding help in a voice that would not take no for an answer. The pass had closed behind them. The snow had not stopped falling since. "Easy da," Fenna said, rising from the table and crossing to him in 2 long strides. She moved like water, Garrett had noticed, all fluid grace despite her height. She was not a giant by any means, standing perhaps 5.5 feet in her worn leather boots, but she carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was capable of. "Do not try to sit up yet." "I am not made of glass, girl," Tormund grumbled, but he subsided under her hands, his breathing labored. His fever had broken yesterday, which was good, but the wound was still angry and hot, which was less good. Garrett had cleaned it 3 times, packed it with yarrow and honey, wrapped it in clean linen, and still he worried about infection taking root. Garrett stood and brought his healer's bag to the bedside, kneeling to check the bandages. Tormund's amber eyes, so like his daughter's, fixed on him with a measuring look that Garrett had felt often over the past 3 days. It was the look of a father gauging a man's intentions, and Garrett had to suppress a wry smile because he was not entirely sure what his intentions were, or if he was allowed to have any. "Wound looks better," Garrett said, which was true if only just. "The swelling has gone down. But you need to stay still and let it knit proper. Another week at least before you should even think about standing." "A week," Tormund repeated, and his voice was a low rumble. "Snowed in here with you and my daughter. You are a patient man, healer." "Garrett," he corrected gently, as he had several times already. "And it is no hardship. I have had quieter winters, but I have had lonelier ones too." Fenna made a soft sound that might have been approval, and when Garrett glanced up, she was watching him again with that steady, considering gaze. He busied himself with retying the bandages, his hands steady even if his thoughts were not. The truth, which he had not said aloud and did not intend to, was that Fenna Frosthelm had walked into his cabin 3 days ago and turned his careful, quiet life sideways. She was smart and funny and unflinchingly kind, and when she smiled at him, it felt like the first thaw after a hard freeze. She had also made it very clear, in a dozen small ways, that her interest in him was not merely gratitude or proximity or boredom. She brought him tea without being asked. She laughed at his jokes, the real laugh that crinkled the corners of her eyes. She sat close when they played cards in the evenings, close enough that he could smell the pine soap scent of her hair. And Garrett, who had been alone for 6 years since his wife Miriam died of the wasting sickness, who had locked his heart away and thrown away the key because it seemed the only sensible thing to do, found himself dangerously close to hoping again, which was foolish, which was terrifying, which he could not allow, because Fenna deserved someone whole and he was not that, not anymore. "I will make more willow bark tea," Fenna said, moving back toward the fire. "He should drink it before he sleeps." "Good," Garrett said, standing and brushing off his knees. "I will check the traps in the morning if the snow eases. We have enough salt pork to last, but fresh meat would not go amiss." "I can check the traps," Fenna offered. "You have done enough." "You carried your father 5 miles through a blizzard," Garrett countered. "I think you have earned a rest." She looked at him over her shoulder, and there was something fond and exasperated in her expression. "You do not rest. Why should I? I am old and set in my ways. You are not old." "I am old enough to know better than to argue with you," he said, and she laughed, the sound bright and sudden in the small space. Tormund coughed again, a wetter sound this time, and Garrett frowned. He returned to the bedside and listened to the Orc's chest, his ear pressed to the broad barrel of his ribs. The lungs sounded congested on the left side, which was worrying. Pneumonia was always a risk with a fever, and out here, snowed in and far from help, it could turn deadly fast. "We will need to keep him upright as much as possible," Garrett said quietly to Fenna. "And steam. Boil water with pine needles and have him breathe it. I will make a poultice for his chest." Fenna's face went tight with worry, but she nodded. "Tell me what to do." They worked together through the evening, Garrett mixing herbs and Fenna boiling water and Tormund bearing it all with stoic silence. By the time they had him settled again, the fire burned low, and the wind outside had risen to a wailing keen that rattled the shutters. Garrett banked the coals and added 2 more logs, then sank into his chair by the hearth with a tiredness that went bone deep. Fenna sat across from him, her long legs stretched toward the warmth. She had braided her dark hair back from her face, and in the firelight her features were all sharp angles and soft shadows. She was lovely, he thought, and then felt guilty for thinking it. "Thank you," she said after a long silence, "for everything. I know we are an imposition. You are not." "We are," she insisted, but there was no heat in it. "You are snowed in with strangers, and one of them is half dead and the other keeps refilling your bowl and watching you like a hawk." Garrett felt his mouth twitch. "I noticed that. Did you?" It was not a question. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, and her gaze was direct and unflinching. "Garrett Everwood, I am going to be very plain with you because I do not believe in wasting time. I like you. I have liked you since the moment you opened your door and did not flinch when you saw what I was, and you let us in without question. And you have spent 3 days saving my father's life without asking for coin or thanks. I think you are kind and steady and far too lonely for a man who smiles as much as you do, and I would like, very much, to know if you might like me too." The words hung in the air between them, honest and terrifying. Garrett's heart kicked hard against his ribs, and for a moment he could not find his voice. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to say that he had noticed the way she moved, the way she laughed, the way she looked at him like he was someone worth seeing. But the weight of his grief pressed down on him, familiar and leaden, and the words that came out were not the ones he wanted. "Fenna," he said, and his voice was gentle, careful. "You are a remarkable woman, truly, but I am not. I cannot." He stopped, searching for the right way to say it. "I was married once." My wife, Miriam, she died 6 years ago, and I loved her more than I knew how to say. I do not think I have another love like that in me. I do not think it would be fair to you to offer you anything less." Fenna was quiet for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she said slowly, "You think love is a finite thing, that you used yours up." "I think I gave everything I had," Garrett said, "and what is left is not enough for someone who mates for life." She rose then and crossed to him and crouched down so they were eye to eye. Her hand covered his where it rested on the arm of the chair, her palm warm and rough with calluses. "Garrett," she said, and her voice was patient and kind and just a little amused, "I did not ask if you loved me. I asked if you liked me. Love is not something that happens all at once, except in songs. It is built, piece by piece, day by day. I am willing to build. The question is whether you are willing to let me try." He stared at her, this orc woman with her green skin and her amber eyes and her relentless, terrifying honesty. And something in his chest cracked open just a little. Not enough to let the light in, not yet, but enough to let him see that maybe, just maybe, the darkness was not as absolute as he had believed. "I do not want to hurt you," he said finally. "Then do not," she said simply. "But do not shut me out because you are afraid of what might happen. That is just another kind of hurt." She squeezed his hand once, then stood and moved back to her own chair, giving him space. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them, and Garrett turned her words over in his mind like stones in a river, feeling their weight and shape. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, something fragile and new began to take root. The days that followed fell into a rhythm, the kind born of necessity and proximity. Garrett woke before dawn each morning to tend the fire and check on Tormund, whose fever spiked and broke and spiked again with a stubbornness that kept them all on edge. Fenna helped with everything, learning the names of herbs and the way to wrap a bandage snug but not tight, and Garrett found himself explaining his work as he did it, half teaching and half thinking aloud. She was a quick study, her hands deft and sure, and he appreciated the help more than he could say. The snow kept falling. The pass stayed closed. The three of them existed in a small bubble of warmth and lamplight while the world outside disappeared under white. On the fourth day, Tormund was strong enough to sit up and eat a bowl of broth on his own, and the relief that flooded through Garrett was sharp and sweet. Fenna cried, just a little, and then laughed at herself and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Tormund grumbled about being fussed over, but there was warmth in his gruff voice, and when he looked at Garrett, he nodded once, a gesture of respect that meant more than words. On the fifth day, Fenna insisted on helping Garrett check the traps, and they bundled up in furs and wool and ventured out into the frozen world. The snow had eased to flurries, and the silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of their boots and the distant cry of a hawk. Garrett showed her how to reset the snares, and she asked questions about the forest and the animals, and the way the seasons turned in this high country. She told him about her home, a small settlement 2 valleys over where orcs and a few humans lived side by side and mostly got along. She spoke of her mother, who had died when Fenna was young, and her brothers, who were scattered across the region working as trappers and scouts. Her voice was fond when she talked about them, and Garrett found himself smiling at her stories. They caught a fat hare in one of the traps, and Fenna dispatched it with a quick efficiency that spoke of long practice. She carried it back to the cabin slung over her shoulder, and Garrett showed her how to skin and clean it, the work easier with 2 pairs of hands. They made a stew that evening, rich with wild onions and dried mushrooms, and Tormund ate 2 bowls and pronounced it the best thing he had tasted in a month. On the 6th day, Garrett woke to find Fenna already up, sitting by her father's bedside and singing softly in Orcish. The language was guttural and lyrical all at once, and though Garrett did not understand the words, he understood the feeling behind them. It was a song of comfort, of home, and it made his chest ache with something he could not name. He lay still in his own cot, watching the firelight play across the walls, and let the sound wash over him. Later, after breakfast, Fenna challenged him to a game of cards, and they played for dried berries and bits of jerky, their banter easy and warm. She won more often than not, and Garrett suspected she might be cheating, but he did not mind. Her laughter was worth losing for. On the 7th day, the wind picked up again and the temperature plummeted, and they huddled close to the fire while the cabin creaked and groaned around them. Tormund slept fitfully, his breathing still labored, and Garrett adjusted his poultices and dosed him with more willow bark tea. Fenna sat beside him, her hand on her father's brow, and whispered something in Orcish that Garrett did not catch. "He will be all right," Garrett said, and he meant it. "He is strong, he is fighting." "I know," Fenna said, but her voice was small. I cannot lose him too, not after Mama." Garrett moved to sit beside her close enough that their shoulders touched. "You will not lose him," he said. "I promise." She turned to look at him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Do not make promises you cannot keep, healer." "I do not," he said, and he held her gaze until she nodded, some of the tension easing from her frame. They sat together in silence, and after a while Fenna's head came to rest on his shoulder, a weight that felt both foreign and right. Garrett did not move. He barely breathed. He just sat there, feeling the warmth of her against his side, and let himself imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like to have this every day. To not be alone. On the 8th day, Tormund took a turn for the worse. His fever spiked high enough to make him delirious, and his wound, which had been healing, began to seep again. Garrett worked with a focus that bordered on desperation, cleaning and repacking the injury, forcing fluids down the orc's throat, doing everything he could think of to pull him back from the edge. Fenna was his shadow, handing him tools before he asked, holding her father down when he thrashed, her face pale but determined. The day bled into night, and the night into the next day, and neither of them slept. Garrett's hands shook with exhaustion, and his vision blurred at the edges, but he kept going because stopping was not an option. Fenna made tea and broth and kept the fire roaring, and once when Garrett stumbled and nearly fell, she caught him and held him upright with a strength that surprised him. "You need to rest," she said, her voice fierce. "You are no good to him if you collapse." "I am fine," he insisted, but even he could hear how hollow the words sounded. "You are not fine," she snapped, and there were tears on her face now, bright tracks against her green skin. "You are exhausted, and you have been working yourself into the ground for days, and I cannot lose both of you, Garrett. I cannot." Her words hit him like a physical blow, and he stared at her, this fierce, stubborn woman who had barged into his life and refused to let him hide, and something in him finally broke open. The fear he had been carrying, the grief, the certainty that he had nothing left to give, all of it spilled out in a rush, and he found himself saying, "I am not empty, Fenna. I am terrified. I am terrified that if I let myself care again, if I let myself hope, it will be ripped away just like before, and I do not think I can survive that twice. I do not think I am strong enough." Fenna's expression softened, and she cupped his face in her hands, her thumbs brushing away tears he had not realized he was shedding. "Strength is not about never breaking," she said, her voice gentle. "It is about breaking and choosing to keep going anyway. You are the strongest man I know, Garrett Everwood, and I am not going anywhere, do you hear me? I am not leaving, not now, not ever." He wanted to believe her. Oh, how he wanted to believe her. But the weight of his fear was still there, pressing down, and all he could do was nod and turn back to Tormund, because saving this man's life was something he could control, something he could do. They worked through another night, and just before dawn, the fever broke. Tormund's breathing eased and his color began to return, and when Garrett checked the wound, it was clean. No sign of the infection that had threatened to take hold. Relief hit him so hard he nearly wept, and when he looked at Fenna, she was already crying, her face buried in her hands. "He is going to be all right," Garrett said, and his voice was hoarse. "He is going to be all right, Fenna." She looked up at him, and then she was on her feet and pulling him into a hug so tight it drove the breath from his lungs. He held her, feeling the shake of her shoulders, the warmth of her breath against his neck, and for the first time in 6 years he let himself feel it. The hope, the fear, the desperate, fragile beginning of something new. "Thank you," she whispered against his ear. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." "You did as much as I did," he said, but she shook her head. "You saved him. You saved us both." They stood there for a long time, holding each other in the gray light of dawn, and Garrett felt something shift inside him. Not healed, not yet, but cracked open enough to let a little light in. The days after that were easier. Tormund recovered steadily, his strength returning day by day, and soon he was sitting up on his own and making jokes about being an invalid. The snow finally stopped falling, and the sky cleared to a brilliant, painful blue. Garrett ventured outside and saw that the drifts were taller than he was in places, sculpted by the wind into strange, beautiful shapes. The world was silent and clean and new. Inside the cabin, things were changing too. Garrett found himself watching Fenna more, noticing the way she hummed while she worked, the way she tilted her head when she was thinking, the way she always made sure his tea was hot and his plate was full. She was still direct, still patient, but there was a new softness in the way she looked at him, as though his confession had opened a door between them. He did not know what to do with that. He had spent so long believing he was done, that his one chance at love had come and gone, and now here was this woman who looked at him like he was worth the effort. It was dizzying. It was terrifying. It was the best thing he had felt in years. On the 10th day, Tormund called Garrett over to his bedside and fixed him with a look that was both stern and amused. "Healer," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I am not a fool, and neither is my daughter. I see the way you look at each other. I see the way she smiles when you are near. And I will tell you this once. If you hurt her, I will hunt you to the ends of the earth and make you regret it. But if you care for her, if you are willing to try, then you have my blessing. She deserves to be happy, and I think, perhaps, you do too." Garrett felt his throat tighten, and he nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Tormund grunted, satisfied, and waved him away. That evening, after supper, Fenna suggested they go outside to look at the stars. The sky was clear, and the moon was nearly full, turning the snow into a field of diamonds. They stood together in the cold, their breath misting in the air, and Garrett felt the peace of it settle into his bones. "It is beautiful," Fenna said softly. "It is," he agreed, but he was not looking at the sky. He was looking at her, at the way the moonlight caught in her hair, at the curve of her profile, at the small smile on her lips. She turned and caught him staring, and her smile widened. "You are not subtle, healer." "I am out of practice," he admitted. "At what?" "At this," he said, gesturing vaguely between them. "At letting myself feel, at not being afraid." Fenna stepped closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her amber eyes. "And how is it going?" she asked, her voice teasing. "Terrifying," he said honestly. "But good. It is good, Fenna." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing through his, and the simple intimacy of it made his heart stutter. "I am glad," she said, "because I meant what I said. I like you, Garrett." and I am willing to wait as long as it takes for you to believe that you are worth liking back." He wanted to kiss her. The thought came sudden and sure, and for once he did not push it away. But this was still too new, too fragile, and he did not want to rush. So instead he squeezed her hand and said, "You are a patient woman." "I am an orc," she said, her grin wicked. "We mate for life, remember? I can afford to be patient." He laughed, the sound surprised and genuine, and she laughed with him. And for a moment the world was just the two of them and the stars and the cold, clear air. The winter wore on, but inside the cabin it felt like spring was already beginning. Tormund grew stronger every day, and by the end of the second week, he was walking short distances with Fenna's help, grumbling about being cooped up but clearly grateful to be alive. The three of them fell into an easy companionship, sharing meals and stories and the long, quiet evenings by the fire. Garrett found himself telling them about Miriam, about the life they had built together and the way she had died, and to his surprise it did not hurt the way he expected. It ached, yes, but it was the ache of an old wound, not a fresh one. Fenna listened without interrupting, her eyes understanding, and when he finished she said, "She sounds like she was wonderful. You were lucky to have her." "I was," he agreed, "but I am learning that being lucky once does not mean you cannot be lucky twice." Fenna's smile was radiant, and Tormund, from his cot, made a noise that might have been approval or indigestion. Garrett chose to believe it was the former. On the 15th day, Garrett woke to the sound of dripping. He sat up, blinking in the early light, and realized the icicles outside the window were melting. The temperature had climbed, just enough to take the edge off the cold, and when he opened the door a crack he saw that the snow had begun to settle and compact. It was not spring, not yet, but the worst of winter was behind them. "The pass will open soon," he said to Fenna over breakfast, and the words felt like a stone in his chest. She nodded, her expression carefully neutral. "Da will be well enough to travel in a week or so, I think. If the weather holds." "Good," Garrett said, because it was good. It was what he had been working toward all along. But the thought of them leaving, of the cabin being empty again, filled him with a loneliness so sharp it took his breath away. Fenna must have seen it on his face, because she reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "We do not have to leave," she said quietly. "Not if you do not want us to." "Your home is 2 valleys over," she interrupted. "Close enough to visit, far enough to start fresh." "If that is what you want." Garrett stared at her, his heart pounding. "Fenna, I cannot ask you to uproot your life for me. That is not fair." "You are not asking," she pointed out. "I am offering. There is a difference." "But Garrett," her voice was patient but firm. "I told you I am willing to build. I meant it. The question is, are you?" He thought about it, really thought about it, for the first time since she had walked into his life. He thought about the long, empty years behind him, the quiet cabin and the careful routine, and the way he had convinced himself that being alone was the same as being safe. And then he thought about the past 2 weeks, the laughter and the warmth and the way Fenna made him feel seen, and he realized that he did not want to go back to the way things were. He wanted this. He wanted her. He wanted the chance to build something new, even if it scared him, even if it meant risking his heart again. "Yes," he said, and the word felt like stepping off a cliff. "Yes, I am." Fenna's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds, bright and warm and impossible to look away from. "Good," she said. "Then it is settled." From the corner, Tormund chuckled. "About time, healer." The days that followed were busy with preparation. Tormund was well enough now to sit at the table and take short walks around the cabin, and his appetite had returned with a vengeance. Garrett checked the wound one last time and pronounced it healed, a thin pink scar the only evidence of how close they had come to losing him. The older orc clasped Garrett's shoulder and said, "You are a good man, Garrett Everwood. I am glad my daughter found you." "I am glad she found me too," Garrett admitted, and Tormund nodded, satisfied. The pass began to open as the temperatures climbed. The snowmelt ran in silver streams down the mountainside, and the first green shoots of early spring poked through the retreating drifts. Garrett walked the trail one afternoon and found it passable, if still treacherous in places, and when he returned to the cabin, he felt a strange mix of relief and dread. "The pass is open," he told Fenna, and she looked up from where she was mending one of her father's shirts. "Then I suppose we should make plans," she said, her voice even. "I suppose we should." They sat together by the fire that evening, Tormund already asleep, and Fenna said, "Come home with us. Meet my brothers, see where I come from. And then, if you still want me to, I will come back here with you. We can decide together where we want to be." It was a good plan, a sensible plan, and Garrett found himself nodding. "All right," he said. "I will come with you, and after," she pressed, her gaze searching. "After," he said slowly, "I think I would like to see where this goes. I think I would like to stop being afraid." Fenna leaned forward and kissed him, a soft press of lips that tasted like hope and promise, and Garrett closed his eyes and let himself feel it. It was not the wild, desperate love he had felt for Miriam, but it was something different, something steadier and warmer and no less real. It was the beginning of something, and for the first time in 6 years, he wanted to see where it led. They left 3 days later, the cabin shuttered and the fire banked, Garrett's pack heavy with supplies and his heart light with possibility. Tormund walked slowly but steadily, and Fenna stayed close to both of them, her hand finding Garrett's whenever the trail grew steep. The journey took 2 days, and they spent the night in a hunter's shelter halfway between, huddled together for warmth and swapping stories under the stars. Fenna's home was a collection of log cabins and sod-roofed houses built into the side of a hill, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys, and the sound of voices carrying on the wind. It was bigger than Garrett had expected, and as they approached he saw orcs and humans moving together, working side by side without the tension he had seen in other settlements. It was a good place, he thought, a place where someone could belong. Fenna's brothers met them at the edge of the village, 3 broad-shouldered orcs who looked Garrett up and down with the same measuring gaze their father had used. But when Fenna introduced him and explained what he had done, their suspicion melted into welcome, and they clasped his hand and thanked him and invited him to share their fire. Tormund was swept away by well-wishers, and Fenna showed Garrett to her home, a small cabin with a garden plot out front and a view of the valley below. "It is not much," she said, almost shy, "but it is mine." "It is perfect," he said, and he meant it. He stayed for a week, and then 2, and by the time a month had passed he could not imagine being anywhere else. Fenna's brothers taught him to fish in the icy river and shared their knowledge of the local plants and animals. The villagers accepted him with an easy friendliness, and more than once someone came to him with an injury or illness, word having spread that there was a healer among them. He worked gladly, grateful to be useful, and found himself settling into this new life with a contentment he had not expected. But his cabin still called to him, the memory of his life there, and one evening he said to Fenna, "I think I need to go back, not to stay but to close that chapter proper, to bring what matters and let the rest go." "I will come with you," she said immediately. "You do not have to, I know," she interrupted, "but I want to. Let me help." So they made the journey together, just the 2 of them this time, and when they reached the cabin it felt both familiar and strange, like looking at a memory through glass. Garrett packed his most treasured belongings, the tools of his trade and a few small things that had been Miriam's, and he walked through the rooms one last time, saying a quiet goodbye to the man he had been. "Are you all right?" Fenna asked, watching him from the doorway. "I am," he said, and it was the truth. "I am ready." They returned to Fenna's village, and Garrett moved into her cabin, and slowly, carefully, they built a life together. It was not always easy. There were moments when his grief rose up unexpected, when he woke from dreams of Miriam and had to remember where he was. But Fenna was patient, and she held him when he needed it and gave him space when he did not. And gradually the weight he had been carrying began to lift. Spring turned to summer, and summer to autumn, and as the leaves began to turn, Garrett realized he was happy. Not in the desperate, clinging way he had been before, but in a quiet, steady way that felt like coming home. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset paint the valley gold, he turned to Fenna and said, "Orcs mate for life, you said." "We do," she confirmed, her eyes curious. "And you have chosen me." "I have." He took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "Then I choose you too. For life, if you will have me." Her smile was everything he had hoped it would be, bright and fierce and full of joy. "I will have you, Garrett Everwood, today and every day after." They were married at the first snowfall, a simple ceremony in the village square with Tormund officiating and Fenna's brothers standing as witnesses. Garrett wore his best shirt, and Fenna wore a wreath of dried flowers in her hair, and when they spoke their vows, the words felt like a promise he knew he could keep. The years that followed were good ones. Garrett became the village healer, his skills valued and his counsel sought, and Fenna worked as a scout and hunter, her knowledge of the land unmatched. They built a life together, full of small joys and shared laughter, and Garrett found that his heart, which he had thought used up, had grown larger and stronger than before. 3 years after they married, Fenna gave birth to a daughter in the early hours of a spring morning, and Garrett held the tiny, squalling infant in his arms and felt his heart break open all over again. They named her Marjuka, and she had her mother's green skin and her father's brown eyes, and Garrett loved her with a fierceness that surprised him. 2 years later, a son followed, born in the golden light of autumn. They named him Tobin, and he was loud and stubborn and perfect, and Garrett marveled at the way life had circled back around, giving him not 1 but 2 chances at love, at family, at happiness. One evening, when Marjuka was 5 and Tobin was 3, the 4 of them sat together by the fire, the children drowsy and content. Fenna caught Garrett's eye and smiled, and he smiled back, feeling the weight of everything they had built together, everything they had become. "Do you remember," she said softly, "that first night when I told you orcs mate for life?" "I do," he said. "I remember being terrified." And now, he looked at her, at their children, at the home they had made, and said, "Now I am grateful. Grateful you were patient. Grateful you did not give up on me." "I would never give up on you," she said, her voice fierce and tender all at once. "You are mine, Garrett Everwood. For life." "For life," he echoed, and he kissed her, and outside the snow began to fall again, soft and steady, covering the world in white. But inside, by the fire, there was only warmth and light and the quiet, enduring certainty of love that had been chosen, built, and earned, one day at a time. Years later, when Garrett was gray and Fenna's tusks had worn smooth at the edges, they would sit together on the porch of their cabin and watch Marjuka and Tobin play with their own children. And Garrett would think back to that winter when Fenna had walked into his life and refused to let him hide. He would think about the man he had been, broken and certain he had nothing left to give, and the man he had become, whole and happy and surrounded by love. "What are you thinking about?" Fenna would ask, her hand finding his as it always did. "I am thinking," he would say, "that I am a very lucky man, twice over." And she would smile, that fierce, bright smile that had captured his heart all those years ago, and she would say, "You are, but so am I." And in the golden light of the afternoon, with the sounds of laughter and life all around them, Garrett would close his eyes and feel the truth of it settle into his bones. He had been given a second chance, a second love, and he had taken it with both hands and held on tight. And in the end, that had made all the difference. The children grew, as children do, and the village thrived, and Garrett and Fenna grew old together, their love deepening with each passing season. They had their share of hardships, of course, the way all lives do, but they faced them together, and that made even the hard times bearable. Tormund lived to see his grandchildren grown, and when he passed, it was peacefully in his sleep, with his family around him. They buried him on the hill overlooking the valley, and Garrett stood beside Fenna as she sang the Orcish death song, her voice strong and clear. And he held her hand and was grateful, so grateful, that he had been given the chance to be part of this family, this life. Marjuka grew into a healer like her father, her touch gentle and her knowledge vast, and Tobin became a scout like his mother, his eyes sharp and his instincts sure. They were good children, kind and strong, and Garrett was proud of them in a way that went beyond words. One winter evening, when Garrett was well into his 60s and Fenna a few years younger, they sat together by the fire as they had so many times before, and Garrett said, "I have been thinking about that first winter, when you told me orcs mate for life and I nearly ran away." Fenna laughed, the sound bright and familiar. "You did not nearly run away, you simply looked like you wanted to." "I was terrified," he admitted. "I thought I had used up my chance at love. I thought there was nothing left for me. And now—" He turned to her, taking in the lines around her eyes, the silver in her hair, the steady warmth in her gaze. "Now I know I was wrong. Love is not a finite thing. It grows, it changes. It builds itself anew if you let it." "And you let it," she said softly. "I did," he agreed. "Because you were patient with me. Because you did not give up." She leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder, and they sat like that for a long time, watching the fire burn down to embers. Outside, the wind howled and the snow fell. But inside there was only warmth and peace and the quiet, enduring knowledge that they had found each other, and chosen each other, and built a life together that was worth every moment of fear, every leap of faith. "I love you," Garrett said, the words as easy now as breathing. "I love you too," Fenna replied. "For life." "For life," he echoed, and he closed his eyes and let the warmth of the fire and the warmth of her presence wash over him. And he thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that he was the luckiest man in the world. The seasons turned, as they always do, and the years flowed like water, and Garrett and Fenna lived out their days in the village they had made their home, surrounded by family and friends and the life they had built together. And when, many years later, Garrett's time came, he went peacefully, with Fenna's hand in his and the faces of his children and grandchildren around him. And his last thought was of gratitude, for the woman who had walked into his cabin on a winter's night and taught him that love, real love, was not something you used up but something that grew richer and deeper with every passing day. And Fenna, who had loved him fiercely and patiently and without reservation, carried that love with her for the rest of her days, knowing that orcs mate for life, and that she had chosen well, and that the life they had built together was a testament to the power of second chances, of hope, and of the quiet, enduring strength of a heart that chooses to love again. In the end, that was the story they left behind, a story of two people who found each other when they needed it most, who built a life together one day at a time, and who proved that love, when tended and nurtured and given room to grow, could bloom even in the harshest winter and last, as all the best things do for life.